AAA games with stunning photorealistic graphics are one of the main driving forces behind the perpetual PC upgrade cycle. But these days it feels like keeping up to date is harder and more expensive than it has any right to be. These stunning games might make you look at your current potato PC like a disappointed parent, but with a few tweaks, they can still look incredible on even a relatively low-spec machine. In the first video in this series, I built two PCs, one maximum spec gaming rig featuring a mighty GeForce RTX 5090 provided by the kind folks at Scan Computers, and the frankly overkill Ryzen 7 9800X3D CPU, as well as one more accessible build. The so-called Universal Minimum Specification PC, or min-spec for short, runs on components from around 2019, and not particularly high-end ones at that. The Ryzen 5 3600 and GeForce RTX 2060 Super meet the minimum requirements for the vast majority of modern games, but are actually lower in terms of overall processing power than the average 2026 machine, according to the Steam Hardware Survey. In that original video, I put the two PCs from opposite sides of the tracks against modern AAA games, a couple of popular multiplayer titles, and some low-spec friendly indie games. Then in the second video, I focused on games that were notorious for being unoptimized, and showed that some games just don't run smoothly even on the most powerful gaming rigs in the world. This time, the focus is less on the latest games, or even the most popular ones, but instead I've chosen some of the best looking games, both in my own humble opinion and those of my audience. That includes recent path-traced behemoths, modern classics, and even one or two older titles that have withstood the test of time. I'm once more choosing appropriate resolutions and settings for the level of hardware being used, and comparing the experience as a whole, fancy graphics or not. I'm not going to accept a 15 FPS stutterfest on the min-spec PC, so if I can't reach a frame rate that I feel's playable without harming image quality, compromises will have to be made. The video is uploaded in 4K, but there will be some loss of quality due to compression, and while some of the footage was captured with an uncapped frame rate while I was making performance benchmarks, for the most part it was captured with VSync enabled to reduce screen tearing. I delayed this video for a few days to include Resident Evil Requiem, and a few days more to include results with the proper Nvidia drivers. And I'm so glad I did. Capcom's recent entries in the Legendary series have all been visually pleasing and featured iconic character designs, but Requiem has instantly earned a place among the best looking games on PC. A lot of that is due to the use of path tracing. This intro sequence in Renwood reminds me of those modded Cyberpunk videos that people claim are like real life, with spectacularly accurate lighting, shadows and reflections. Path tracing, in case you're unaware, is the most accurate kind of ray tracing currently available in games. Rather than using a combination of pre-baked rasterized rendering with ray-traced elements, everything is ray-traced. Each shadow is cast by a light source, and every material has reflective properties and different degrees of roughness affecting how glossy or matte they appear. Just like in a high-end 3D rendering program. Rendering games this way takes a lot of processing power and some serious compromise in terms of performance. This method creates noise or graininess, and technologies like DLSS ray reconstruction are required to combat this. The end result looks spectacular, but even the max spec gaming rig, which these days might as well be made of solid platinum thanks to the RAM shortage, barely manages 30 FPS in the very demanding opening street scene. Adding quality DLSS helps dramatically, bringing an acceptable 66 FPS average with minimal quality loss and ghosting. This is Resident Evil. We do zombies, not ghosts. That's all well and good for those lucky few with RTX 5090s, but how about the rest of us? Well, the RTX 2060 Super is actually the GPU recommended by Capcom for 1080p 60fps with quality upscaling, with a warning that it may still experience drops below 60 under high processing load. The street scene happens to be one of those high-load areas, so it's a good candidate for a stress test, and with ray tracing disabled I found it could actually average nearly 70 FPS, with 1% lows under 50. That latter part may be down to the CPU, as this Ryzen 5 3600 is a bit of a drop in single-threaded performance compared to the 5500 recommended by Capcom. Getting close to a locked 60 is possible with quality DLSS, as it's said in the system requirements, and quality isn't too badly affected by this. However, in achieving a near-perfect 60 FPS, we did have to sacrifice ray tracing altogether, and path tracing is out of the question. Still, I was able to keep image quality relatively high using the normal settings preset, which includes features like subsurface scattering and hair strands to make the humans look more realistic, and depth of field to simulate the effects of being recorded on a real camera. For lower spec machines, or those looking to maximise performance, you can drop to the lowest preset and turn hair strands off. This strips away a lot of the cinematic style of the game, but the models actually still hold up. Capcom don't have any specific hardware recommendations for enabling ray tracing, but despite its age and low cost, the 2060 Super is still an RTX card, so I was curious as to how it would hold up under RT. At native 1080p with standard TAA, you could maybe enjoy the game at around 30 FPS, with the occasional drop. Quality DLSS helps maintain a 30 plus minimum, but to even get close to 60 you need to go all the way down to DLSS performance. This drops the internal resolution from 1080p to 540p, and while the details hold up remarkably well considering, post effects like reflections and bokeh depth of field, which are usually rendered at half or quarter resolution, now look particularly low quality. Even the new DLSS Model L, which is frankly miraculous in some circumstances, struggles with the rainy streets of Renwood, and because this new kind of upscaling algorithm is designed for newer RTX 40 and 50 series GPUs, the performance hit is substantial. I played through the first 45 minutes of the game at these settings using performance upscaling and the Model L preset, and frankly it looks and plays astonishingly well, but I'm not sure if this is the best way to play. How's this for tonal whiplash? In my opinion, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is graphically one of the most impressive games of recent years, and I don't think it's appreciated enough. The game has a real Saturday morning cartoon vibe that I don't think's been matched in any other game, and the visuals are key to that. This is all real time, nothing pre-rendered at all, so when your hardware can't keep up, it can be pretty punishing. I actually tested out an old Nvidia GT 710 in this one, and it still gives me nightmares. Although Rift Apart is a PS5 original release, the PC port by Nixies includes a lot of modern tech advances, including various kinds of upscaling and frame generation, and offers ray tracing reflections, shadows, and ambient occlusion, which aren't all available on the console version. The Richie Rich PC blazes through Rift Apart with everything turned on, averaging 92 FPS at 4K without any form of upscaling or frame generation, though the cinematic cutscenes do experience the occasional bump in the road when there's a camera cut or other kind of transition. This is unfortunately just one of those things we've come to expect from Insomniac games. See Marvel's Spider-Man 2 for a significantly worse example. On the budget-priced PC, ray tracing is off the table, not necessarily because of performance limits, but mostly because of VRAM. The 8GB limit of the RTX 2060 Super means we'd only be able to turn on some very limited RT effects before stuttering became a problem, so rather than risk hurting the gaming experience for the sake of some reflections, I tested at 1080p medium without any RT. There's a pretty major difference in performance between anti-aliasing types too. With Nvidia's DLAA, the game runs at a 67 average, but drops her closer to 50, whereas using temporal anti-aliasing gives almost a 15% bump in FPS. Running at medium does sacrifice some image quality beyond merely shadows and reflections. Crowd sizes are smaller, the draw distance is reduced, and some of the fur effects are a bit less refined than on very high settings. But these are the compromises that have to be made to keep the game playable, and I don't know about you, but I still think it looks pretty impressive, even next to the expensive system. Hellblade 2 Senua's Saga is a triumph in modern graphics and is definitely one title to show off your fancy new PC hardware. Unreal Engine 5 is an engine that, in the wrong hands, can produce fairly flat, generic visuals, but Ninja Theory have treated this as an exercise in movie-level realism. It's a must-see experience, but not quite a must-play one, with a lot of the gameplay amounting to pushing the analog stick forward and some fairly repetitive melee combat. The monster PC can handle Hellblade 2 at max settings, but I found DLSS-Q helps it stay above 60 FPS consistently, whereas without it, the game falls a little short of the mark. Moving on to the lower spec machine, it's tough to maintain playable performance. At 1080p low, quality upscaling's needed to hit a 60 average, and although I didn't have time in this video, it might be a good use case for the new DLSS model I tried in Ori Requiem. The upscaling has some impact on quality, but ironically, that's not such a concern here. A lot of Hellblade 2's cinematic realism comes from the use of post-processing effects like bokeh depth of field, motion blur, and chromatic aberration, all of which result in some amount of blurriness. The drop in details become more noticeable during the many close-ups, but honestly, it still looks great in moments like these. The lower quality settings do affect some of Senua's features. I particularly noticed her eyebrows were darker and more artificial looking than at very high, but it's nothing you wouldn't see in Birmingham on a Saturday night. Side by side you can very clearly see differences, especially if you're watching on a decent sized display or maybe if you pinch to zoom on your phone, but the overall visual style is still there even on the low spec machine. I have a soft spot for Remedy games, ever since the first Max Payne almost a quarter century ago.
Hello darkness, my old friend.
Alan Wake 2 continues the studio's pursuit of cinematic realism and is another of the still remarkably short list of games that supports full path-traced rendering. Of course, graphics aren't all about lighting and reflections, and you can appreciate the detailed performance capture and models of actors like Melanie Liebert, Ilka Vili, Sam Lake, and whichever Ashmore this is, with or without PT. Again, that hyper-realistic lighting is extremely demanding on even the highest NPC, with balanced DLSS taking the internal render resolution down to just over 1200p, and still, 60 FPS isn't guaranteed. On the lower spec machine, there's not really any way of achieving a solid 60 FPS without taking a 2x4 to the image quality. At 1080p low settings, things look largely detailed and not substantially worse than before, but again, the need for DLSS to maintain even close to a constant 60 hits the post-processing effects, of which there are a lot. Alan Wake 2 is a pretty game, no doubt about it, but scalable it's not. When it was first released, Horizon Forbidden West sparked a conversation about how much new graphics technology is actually needed. Yes, it's cool we can now play games that are so advanced we can see the fuzz on the character's skin, but am I really paying for this? Didn't the first game already look pretty good? Is this really what next gen means? Obviously, I'm in two minds about this. In case it's not already clear, I'm a sucker for fancy graphics, but I'm also someone who doesn't normally have a lot of disposable income. I really appreciate it when a graphical showcase like this is also highly scalable, so that it can be enjoyed even by people who can't afford the latest and greatest hardware. That being said, it seems like the 5090 system is a bit overkill here anyway, as you're free to push the sliders all the way to the right and still see north of 100 FPS even without DLSS. The budget build, meanwhile, can achieve 60 FPS and still retain a good level of image quality. The medium preset does mean that some effects have an extremely short draw distance, but overall there's nothing too disappointing here. Some scenes do dip a little below the 60 mark, so perhaps adding some DLSS might help the overall experience. Of course, no tech-forward conversation about PC graphics is complete without the poster child for real-time ray tracing, Cyberpunk 2077. Night City looks amazing in normal rasterized rendering, of course, but thanks to the developers working closely with Nvidia, the game has been an early platform for technology like path tracing, ray reconstruction, and transformer upscaling, which help deal with some of the noise and artifacts that result from using fewer rays and lower resolutions in the name of performance. Unfortunately, these new technologies are optimized for RTX 40 and 50 series, so they don't have quite the same benefit on the 2060 Super. With all the bells and whistles turned on, the Max Spec rig is still challenged by Cyberpunk. I found DLSS Balanced was the best choice to hold a 60+ experience in the RT overdrive mode, though you might get by with quality if you don't mind the occasional drop. Again, the budget PC is best without ray tracing, whereby it can manage to run at the high preset without any upscaling and still get a 60+ average. The heavy drops here are more to do with the CPU. Cyberpunk's City Centre can hammer older, weaker processors, and I think something like a Ryzen 5 5600 or an i5 12400 would be a better fit. RT made itself mandatory for the first time in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, but while that was the factor that stood out most to those of us who talk about budget gaming, and one of the reasons why so many PC gamers wrote it off immediately, the character design and overall visual style of Indy is hard to find fault with. Okay, so I wrote that down because I think people might have the impression that I hate this game, and I don't at all, so I needed to make that clear. But I also do have one nitpick that I needed to talk about without being called a hater. Am I the only one that thinks the character's teeth are just a little too big? Like 5 to 10% bigger than human teeth should actually be. Although Indy is all in on ray tracing, there's also the option to enable path tracing for that extra level of fidelity at a significant cost to performance. The benefit of path tracing is most apparent in shadow draw distance. Using default settings, the normal shadows drop to a low resolution version at a distractingly short distance in front of the player. Path tracing renders shadows perfectly, with proper umbral fall-off further from the object casting it, but as with the other games tested so far, even the RTX 5090 needs some help from DLSS. In the jungle section, I found DLSS performance was necessary for the full locked 60 FPS experience, meaning the actual render resolution is just 1080p. The budget PC doesn't need any upscaling and can run the game at 1080p just fine, though while the medium preset should be enough for a 60 FPS experience, that would require more VRAM than the 2060 Super has available to it. A 12GB 2060 or 3060 or a comparable AMD or Intel Arc GPU could handle the whole game at medium, but the 2060 Super needed a few settings dropped to low. What's truly disappointing is that this doesn't seem to affect much. Textures are scaled dynamically in most modern games, and that means that sometimes stuff like Indy's Canteen and Satipo's shoes have low-res textures on both the 7-year-old entry-level GPU and the cutting-edge 32GB flagship. Like the movies, Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora is a visual spectacle that I think anyone except the hardest core fans has probably forgotten even exists. I'm always surprised that the Avatar fandom is still around, but it came up in the comments of my community post asking for recommendations, so evidently there's some crossover. Avatar takes mandatory ray tracing in another direction. Its real-time global illumination uses hardware RT, but also has a software fallback for systems that lack the necessary bits. The Unobtainium PC couldn't quite handle the game at 4K Ultra without upscaling, only managing just over 50 FPS. I opted for DLSS quality, which gives almost 100 FPS on average, but only 67 on the low end. There is apparently a hidden Unobtainium quality preset that can be accessed by a launch argument in the Ubisoft app, but it didn't work for me, and I didn't feel the need to spend a day diagnosing why not. The game still looks great at Ultra. The budget build needed dropping all the way to low, as well as DLSS-Q to reach a 60fps average, and that has a significant impact on visuals. The biggest loss seems to be shadows, especially once you get out into the jungle. The low-res shadows flicker constantly, but I guess if you want to enjoy Pandora on an older rig, this is the price you pay. Beautiful games, especially those in the AAA space, tend towards maximalism. The jungles of Pandora, the kaleidoscope of Megalopolis, the photorealism of Bright Falls. Control, Remedy's game prior to Alan Wake 2, was another request from the audience, and its beauty is as much from its minimal, brutalist interiors as its uncannily real digital actors. Well, real by 2019 standards at least. Control was one of the first games to feature real-time RT. In fact, it was probably the first new release that featured more than one ray tracing effect, and that's contributed not only to the game's aesthetic, but also its performance. Despite its age and relatively small scope, Control at max settings performs worse than Avatar, averaging 80 FPS with quality DLSS. Still, very much playable and stunning to look at, though the close-ups on Jessie do start to show the limitations of 2019-era textures. But at least you can actually see them. Control's method of handling video memory is uniquely annoying. The budget PC could happily run the game at 1080p Ultra without ray tracing, if it fit inside VRAM. Alas, 8GB isn't quite enough, so a lot of textures, rather than simply stepping down to the next available version, just go missing, thus negating half the point of choosing Ultra settings. Dropping to high improves image quality simply by dint of stuff actually loading, and the average frame rate is almost 90. Going with rasterization has its drawbacks. The shadows around hair break up and look ugly at times, and screen space reflections cut off in weird ways, but RT isn't going to fit nicely within an 8GB frame buffer, so this is probably about as good as it gets. I talked in my ray tracing essay about how the games industry has grown up without the means to produce RT in real time, and therefore learned to live without it. Rockstar's Red Dead Redemption 2 is perhaps the prime example of image quality before the advent of RTX graphics cards. It's testament to what can be achieved with huge teams of talented artists, long development cycles, and more money than God. Which I guess makes it seem less impressive, but none of that stops 2019's RDR2 remaining one of my favourite visual experiences on PC. It's easy to get oohs and ahs with a Los Santos sunset, but the opening scenes of RDR2 feature blizzards and snowy mountains that are both technically impressive and beautiful to look at. With the sliders dragged all the way to the right, including the notoriously heavy multi-sample anti-aliasing, RDR2 is demanding as hell. My usual benchmark run is a quick trot around Saint Denis, which can be rough going on both the CPU and GPU, and the average is a mere 69 FPS. Honestly, MSAA isn't even that important at this resolution, but without it the game runs at over 100 FPS, and I can't capture 4K footage at that rate, so there wasn't any benefit to it. Choosing quality settings is a bit awkward in this game at the best of times, so for the low spec PC I just left the overall quality slider in the middle. At 1080p, this results in some less impressive texture work, and there might be a benefit to manually tweaking that and anisotropic filtering to improve quality a little, but it's not all that bad, and it still runs at a very healthy 80 FPS. While I was polling my audience for games to feature in this video, someone suggested A Plague Tale Requiem. I played most of the first game, Innocence, but I never got further than the opening section of Requiem, as it was one of my main benchmarking titles for 2022. part of the benchmarker's curse is that we get to play every major new game release out there, but only in small select chunks, and seldom get to enjoy the whole game, but every time I benchmark it I feel like I want to play more. Maybe one day. Anyway, the Max Spec machine enjoys RT shadows, which makes a noticeable difference to characters, especially in cutscenes. It can even manage to run in full 4K with DLAA, no upscaling at around 80 FPS, so unless you're dead set on maxing out a high refresh monitor, there's no need to drop image quality on your multi-$1,000 gaming rig. The more budget conscious will struggle with this game. 1080p low still needs upscaling to reach 60 FPS, and DLSS quality doesn't stop frame drops below 50 from time to time. Image quality holds up pretty well despite this. It might not be as photorealistic as on the RTX 5090, but it still looks excellent for a game made by a relatively small team. Another game from a smaller team that manages to have stellar visuals. This time, the uniqueness of Hi-Fi Rush is its use of cel-shaded 3D rendering, which, like the rest of the game, could be seen as a throwback to previous generations. In fact, I'd put it up there with Dragon Ball FighterZ as one of the few titles that actually pulls cel-shading off almost seamlessly, looking more like a 2D cartoon than some actual cartoons. And this promises to make Hi-Fi Rush timeless. It also means that both systems can handle it at 4K high settings. Granted, the cheaper PC would drop below 60 FPS at times, but the average is a healthy 95. For the sake of seeing what a lower spec gamer would have to look forward to, I also dropped the 2060 Super Machine to 1080p low to see what, if anything, it did to image quality, and in my opinion, it's not a whole lot. Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed series might be known more for its bloat these days, but it's also rightly admired for its dedication to creating authentic, if not completely accurate, historical settings. I'm a huge fan of the Greek and Egyptian recreations of Odyssey and Origins respectively, but even back in the earlier games they were making some gorgeous historic landscapes. I flipped a coin between Unity and Syndicate, set in revolutionary Paris and Victorian London respectively, and Unity won 2 out of 3. Unity has been held up for a long time as a beautiful game from the early part of the 8th console generation, with generous amounts of detail in the Parisian landscape and particularly large crowds of NPCs. With the massively demanding 8x multi-sample anti-aliasing, the bourgeois PC achieves close to 90 FPS at 4K Ultra. Meanwhile, the proletarian PC acquits itself admirably, only requiring a drop to 1080p and the default level of anti-aliasing to hit 72 FPS. The 2014 era textures and models don't benefit much from the higher resolution, so there's really very little to tell the two apart. Back in the 8th console generation, there were a few games that made people wonder whether graphics had already peaked, and I remember a lot of that conversation being centred around Uncharted 4. It wasn't until years later, well into the ray tracing era, that PC gamers finally got to experience Uncharted for themselves, and by then, some of the novelty had worn off. Still, it's another remarkable achievement, considering it was developed for the original PS4, and another testament to what a big team of great artists can achieve if you give them enough time and money. Oh, and crunch the hell out of them, of course. The difference between model quality and animation in cutscenes and in gameplay is pretty stark. Later games like The Last of Us Remastered blur the lines between the two much more neatly, but the result is that the game runs exceptionally well on both rigs. The Max Spec machine can have all these settings maxed out and enjoy a ludicrous 200 FPS, whereas the low spec PC only reaches 93 by dropping to 1080p, but resolution aside, they both look as good as each other. When it comes to 2D games, beauty can be in the eye of the beholder. Not everyone sees the attraction in games like Shovel Knight or Undertale, and even inarguably high-fidelity games like Streets of Rage 4, Cuphead and Silksong don't really get talked about in PC enthusiast circles because 2D hasn't been challenging to render since the 20th century. Still, I like a lot of games in this genre, and I'll take any excuse to shoehorn them into the conversation, so I've included one of the most beautiful examples of the side-scrolling Metroidvania, Ori and the Will of the Wisp. Unlike Silksong, or indeed Ori and the Blind Forest, there is some hardware challenge here, as the player, enemies and NPCs are rendered 3D objects, rather than hand-painted or pre-rendered sprites. Still, the rest of the game assets are mostly 2D, and even the 3D is rasterized, so these RTX GPUs aren't having their RT cores particularly taxed. The expensive PC was hardly worth benchmarking. It's chugging along at 440 FPS and wasting a whole lot of electricity in the process. The cheaper PC runs at those same settings at just 52 FPS with lows of 39, so it would definitely benefit from some lower settings just to remain playable. With resolution dropped to 1080, the game looks basically the same, only now it's a smooth 180 FPS on average. So, after 15 gorgeous games across 2 wildly different PCs, what have we learned? That money can't buy a better experience? No, that's definitely not the case. Good graphics don't need expensive hardware, but expensive hardware still makes good graphics even better, and makes them easier to enjoy at playable frame rates. But we knew that already. I guess what I've learned is that a lot of games still look great at low to medium settings, that DLSS is getting really good, and that no amount of fancy AI upscaling can fix some low-resolution post-processing effects. If you'd like to see how these 2 PCs handle the least optimised games of recent times, that video is on screen now. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time. That took over an hour to read. Good God, my voice, I have no voice. My voice is gone. The voice is gone, people. I can't shout. I can't raise my voice. I have no bass left. I have no bass in my voice.